My name's Callum Skye. I am in the barony of Twin Moons, obviously in the kingdom of Atenveldt. So if you are outside of that, welcome. And we're going to be going over arrow making today. I've been involved with archery really kind of my entire life since I was a young child, where my parents, to get me out of the house, probably gave me a bow and kicked me out into the desert, kind of thing. So we didn't have street lights, so it was not like back before the street lights. It was, back while you still could, while it was still light. So, but basically, so I've done archery really my entire life. I've been involved with SEA archery for the last 6 years. So I really enjoy it, and I enjoy the arrow making aspect of it as well. That was one of the first things that I kind of set out to do was, well, I want to make my own, arrow set so that I had a really good set to be able to shoot in tournaments. And that is a big part of SEA archery, is really kind of making your own arrows, or some people have them made. There's a lot of people that'll do that, and they'll make arrows for other people, though it's not so complicated. And hopefully we'll kind of simplify that process today. Though I am going to be talking about maybe some technical aspects of it. I can get kind of techie at times, but for the most part, it is not as complicated as we want to make it seem, and we'll try to keep it as simple as possible. All right, so let's go ahead and let's jump right into it. Arrow in its basic form. So real simply here, we've got a head to the arrow, or a point. You've got your shaft. You've got the fletchings that glue onto them, and you've got a nock. And that's it. It's not a super complicated, device. There's some complicated reasons of why we choose and what we do in regards to some of these things. And that's kind of where I'll have some of the discussion today in regards to some of the fun stuff that we do as we build these arrows. But I can tell you from a starting standpoint, it's just like archery. You get better by lots of practice. I have built lots of arrows, and not all of them have been huge successes. I have tried and experimented with things and gone back to other directions. So, like I said, there's some good principles that once you kind of learn the principles, you're really not going to make a lot of mistakes kind of going through it. And because it's one of those things that, depending on how often you shoot, you're going to wear your arrows. I'm making about probably a dozen to 2 dozen a year, going through arrows, just based on shooting them and splitting them, and quite often. So, but let's get into some of the details here, but that's the basic aspect of it. To start off with, I kind of want to go in and start talking about nocks. Nocks are probably one of the most common things that we want to focus on in regards to really making sure that we have it done correctly. And this can sometimes vary depending on the type of material that we're using. So if you see here, I've kind of broken down the most common ones. This is a set of mine down here on the right, the bottom right, and these are just plastic nocks. So they come in a variety of different sizes. And they basically, the ones that I have here are ones that snap on, and they're glued onto the end of the shaft. So the end of the shaft, you can buy a little pencil sharpener kind of device that puts a pointed end on the end of the shaft, and you can just glue these nocks on. That way, if you hit them, break them, which does happen quite often as you're shooting, because you're going to be hitting the back ends of them, you're going to split some nocks here and there. It's probably one of the easiest things that you're constantly doing maintenance on. I would recommend, if you make yourself a set, buy an extra dozen of these plastic nocks, because you'll break them over time, and they'll wear. That is one of the reasons why this is probably the most common type arrow that you'll see in the SEA, is plastic nocks on the end of them, just because they stand up to wear probably better, for a wooden arrow. So what some of the other options that you have is if you're shooting bamboo style arrows are really common if you're doing Asian archery. So I shoot um, like a Mongol. It's actually a Ming style, but it's a horse bow, and it's an Asian archery type bow. And I've shot in the past the bamboo arrows. I personally have not been a big fan of them. Some people swear by them. They love, the stiffness of them and the way that they shoot. Um, Personally, I've not been a big fan of shooting with them, but you may find that they're a little bit different. I've found actually some inconsistencies in them in regards to the spine weights, and harder to find really kind of a complete set. And here, living in the desert, the dryness dries them out significantly, and you get to a point where they just start splitting and falling apart really, really quick. So unfortunately, bamboo's not been my best friend, but where you're at, bamboo arrows may be the way to go. So feel free to experiment around with them. Bamboo arrows have these little insert nocks. And if you see here, I kind of did a close-up version of one of them. It's a little wooden knock that's already kind of pre-done, and it's basically just got a little pillar, and it's going to go right inside that bamboo shaft. And then you can basically just kind of file it down to fit perfectly. The nice thing is that you can buy these pre-made, and this would qualify as a period type style arrow, which is very commonly shot. Now, some of the more common, probably period style arrows for our period shoots are probably going to be your self nocks that are just filed into the shaft. Which is kind of an example here. If you're shooting a hard enough grained wood, yeah, I mean, it's probably fine to be able to shoot this, just as a filed in. It doesn't have to be as complex as, some of the other options that are out there. You can just file it in perfectly. I bought a little jeweler's kit. And this is what I'd recommend is if you get into doing some of the self nocks, you want little fine tools to be able to put the fine edges on them. So I bought a jeweler's kit to be able to get in doing this. And I'll touch a little bit more on them, on doing some of these self nocks in a second. One of the other aspects is a reinforced self knock. And you can reinforce these here with hardwood, horn, or bone. I personally have just picked up some bone, and then you just file them down and insert them in there, and then they basically reinforce this tip. That way, if you hit it with the back of another arrow, or if you are just shooting them, and there's a little bit of damage to them, they hold up a little bit better because of having the horn reinforcements in them. So self nocks. So I'll show you an example. And these pictures that I've got here is from one of my last adventures into building some self nocks, and a guide in regards to kind of how we would go about building it. Now, like you said, this is simply replaced. Like if you guys are looking at building your own arrows, you can just buy the plastic knock and you're done. Like glue it on, put it on, and you're done. And for your first so many sets of arrows, unless you're wanting to shoot in a period shoot, I would recommend that is probably the best way for you to go from a reliability standpoint, is going with the plastic knock, mainly because of the durability. When you go to a self knock, realize that there's a lot more time involved. And the other aspect is your arrows the knocks are going to come apart much quicker because of other people hitting the back ends of your arrows, you hitting the back ends of your arrows, and then basically just kind of letting go over time. So unfortunately, like I said, if you're shooting a lot or even shooting inconsistently, I would probably recommend going to a plastic knock. You'll be able to shoot in most of your tournaments and activities that we do, unless you want to shoot specifically in a period shoot or rank in a period fashion. And then I would recommend going to something like this. And this is it seems like it may be complicated with diagrams and everything, but it's pretty simple. And what made it real simple is this little device here. So this is a little jig that basically I just have it clamped into my vise. And what you do is there's a lot of methods to saw into it. You can use a file, or you can basically just go in. I took 3 hacksaw blades and put them together into a hacksaw, and basically it cut the perfect thickness down here to be able to go on my string. So pretty simple, and then you just file off the rough edges with your file. It has 2 different directions, as you can see demonstrated here in this example. So if you can see, like, there's one cut that you're going to cut, which is going to be long, and that's going to be for the horn insert. So let's say that's on this side over here, going on this direction. You'll cut that down and you'll drop that horn insert in. Then you just glue it in. So horn glues to wood very, very well. Most wood glues are all you're going to need to be able to affix that down there. And as you see, put a clamp on it, come back 24 hours, and then you can basically file down the sides. So you basically just file that edge off. But just like that, you're going to cut down, file down one that goes in, fits in perfectly, put a little clamp on it, and then you'll just cut off the excess. Once you've cut off the excess, then all you're going to do is you're going to cut in about half the distance in for the knock with a little bit of a file. This little jig makes it nice because it's already pre-cut in regards to the distance of them. And once you do that, you're basically just going to file down to that half area and make it smooth for your string to fit into it. One of the things that I recommend, I like my arrows to kind of snap on. So in doing so, if you can see in this diagram here how they kind of put in a little like a little circle here at the bottom of it. This is one of the things that if you're going to venture into this that I recommend. It makes it a lot easier for the string to fit into it. And if you just bought like a little jeweler's kit, which I can tell you was probably about $6 or $7 at Ace Hardware, and has the little tiny files, you can go in and easily file in a little place for your string to fit once it knocks in. While going through this process, what I recommend is I had my bow out. So I had my string that was there, and as I'm filing and really kind of sanding it down, I made sure that the fit was perfect. It's real easy when you're sitting there filing away to overfile, and then it's really loose on it, which can sometimes be frustrating for the shooter. So a light file, check the size, light file, check the size, really kind of fine tune it. And then you have arrows that are really kind of built specifically for your string. And then obviously kind of round it out. Here's an example of one of mine after I had rounded everything out. So self knocks obviously would be that step above that you could go with that, but not always required. Do you have any questions on
Callum,
knocks?
when you round off the tips there at the last stage, is that just for aesthetics or comfort, or is it period?
Yeah, so I don't know from a period standpoint, mainly only because I think that, from the aspect of, man, if I was a medieval archer and I have to make, 100,000 arrows, for a league of archers, I don't know if I would go to that effort. So I don't know if you went through like arrows found out there in fields and things like that, if they would have had those additional efforts made to them, because again, they were looking at like, hey, I got to throw 1,000 arrows down at these people who are charging the gates. They probably were less focused about some of these little fine details. But a lot of why I'm doing that is so that I'm not snagging my string. So I'm trying to maintain the string as best as possible so that it's smooth going in, and that also if you can see how they're rounded here, if a arrow does impact it, it gives me a chance to have it deflect off of the end rather than splitting it down. Because once you split it, it's over. And you may spend anywhere from, $20 to $30 to build an arrow. You're going to do everything you can to kind of make sure that it's going to hold up as best as possible.
Fantastic.
Um,
Thank you.
but that's what I do, is just to be able to, hopefully it glances off of it rather than hitting and taking a chunk out of that arrow.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I even have an example of one as well. So I'll put it up here. So I now have a background, which I don't know if it'll allow me to do it here, but this is an arrow. I think my background is messing up with the,
It's not too bad. It's pretty good.
yeah, okay, perfect. So this is basically an arrow that I made, and you can kind of see the finished effort on it, with it versus this one here, which has my plastic knocks on it. And I can tell you, I shoot the plastic knocks the majority of the time. I have the other set so that I can shoot in tournaments, and I have weighted them the same. They're the identical arrow. The only difference is the knock, and the fact that because of the time involved in building these self knocks, I don't want to destroy a bunch, shooting on a daily basis. And I don't shoot every day, but almost every other day I'm out shooting. So you go through knocks often. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about fletching. So this is probably where I think most of us really get a chance to explore some of our creative avenues a little bit, is in regards to what we do with the fletching. So I want to basically, I was just going to show here, these are the common fletchings, right? 2 fletchings, 3 fletchings, different options of 4 fletchings. And then I just threw this picture up here because I'd never seen it before. 8 fletchings on an arrow. I don't know if that's effective, but I thought it was kind of funny to see. So, and obviously it's a modern arrow, but different fletchings amounts you can kind of see, and then how they're orientated on there is different ways. So your 2 fletchings are most often used on a crossbow. Obviously, because of it laying flat on a crossbow, it's really difficult to have a 3rd fletching and have it equally on there correctly. So 3 fletchings are not very common on a period style crossbow. So you're going to see 2 fletchings, and it's effective. Anyone have any idea of why we actually have fletchings on arrows?
To help with the shot.
Okay.
It makes the arrow spin, right?
It can, yeah, yep. So it can make the arrow spin, though I would say that that's not 100%. It does have that ballistic effect that does make it spin.
It's an aeronautics thing.
Okay. So the way that I would look at it, from a aerodynamic standpoint, and is it adds stability to the arrow. And the reason why is it's a parachute. So think of it this way, of it's creating this drag that is perfectly aligned on the back end. It actually is slowing your arrow down. Your arrow would travel much quicker and much faster without fletchings on it. But it's adding drag, and we want drag at some level is so that the arrow stays orientated going straight, because it allows us to actually hit a target going straight on. So we want to have a certain amount of drag. How much is up to the dynamics of the arrow. You can put too much drag on it and probably be okay. Not enough drag of it, and you might actually see the arrow going in some different places. So there's some different ways that we go about adding it, but we're actually adding weight and we're slowing the arrow down when we're doing it. So we want to be careful in regards to how much we're doing it and is it enough. So with a crossbow bolt, as you see here, we're adding just enough drag on it to be able to kind of straighten the arrow out, but it's not really creating as much of a spinning effect as we would if we had 3 or 4 arrows. And once we create a spinning effect, it's almost like a rifle shot. You'll see that there's a lot more precision if you can create that spinning effect to it. And we'll talk about how we create that in regards to fletchings in a second, because we'll talk about, you know, different ways to start creating some of that spinning. So what you'll see is 3 fletches is probably the most common that's out there. 3 fletches is finding that perfectly alignment of drag that's kind of orientating the arrow straight, but is not adding so much weight that we're now having to increase, let's say, how we're shooting. It's still comfortable to shoot with 3 arrows. A lot of people like 4 fletches. And the reasons why with 4 fletches is that you don't have to worry about this one awkward one that's considered, they call it the cock feather. So they consider, let's say, the awkward one here, the cock feather, and they'll consider these 2 the hen feathers when they talk about it. And so when you're actually lining up against your brace on your bow, you're always wanting to orientate the cock feather out so that it doesn't interfere hitting the brace. You don't really have to worry about that if you have 4 feathers on it. So in that kind of situation, you actually get the opportunity to be less concerned with how it's orientated. You just kind of find out the best way that it goes on the string, and then you shoot it from there. So this right here is kind of equal distanced when you put on 4 fletches, which is a common way to do it. So, and that way, it really kind of doesn't matter how it's orientated. You're just really kind of putting on 4 fletches, and they're equally distanced, and they'll have the equal drag on it. Now, this option here, it's kind of funny because they actually did it wrong because of the way the string would be. You would actually, and this may be because of, I may have stolen this from a graphite shooter. So graphite shooters and your compound shooters typically shoot in this orientation, while we're shooting against a brace. We're worried about clearing a brace. So because of that, clearing the brace, we're more concerned with how these feathers rub against that brace, not how they're rubbing against how they stand on the bottom here. So in this situation, what they do is you want to span it out here, a little bit different percentages in regards to the distances, and a lot of your fletching jigs will actually allocate the space so that we can open it up that way. So when you put it onto your bow, the arrows pass by the brace without as much disturbance, which is kind of the reason why you want to split them up this way, but you're still getting the benefit of additional drag that's equally distanced around the arrow. So I mentioned jigs. So I want to talk a little bit about jigs. So when we're setting it up on a 3 arrow or a 4 arrow setup, the jig is going to be important to be able to set it up. And most jigs are adjustable. That allows you to adjust for having either 3 arrows or 4 arrows on your shaft. One of the more popular is going to be what's called the Blitzenberger. I personally am a large fan of the Blitzenberger and I think I've got 4 of them now. Every year I just buy another one. It's kind of a Christmas thing that we do, because the more you have, the easier it is to make a set. And so they're, you know, more expensive than some of the other options, but they're just super reliable in regards to what they do. They make the job really easy. I also have one of these fletching jigs, and honestly, if I was just going to be, hey, I'm a regular shooter, I want to shoot in some tournaments and have some fun, and I just want to make some sets, I am a big fan of using one of these. Now, it doesn't give you the flexibility. Like, I can do lots of different things. I can go to a 4 fletch from a 3 fletch, or I can change the angle. And there's lots of different things that I can change and do with the Blitzenberger. This is called an Arizona Fletcher. The Arizona Fletcher, you buy them as you want them. So if you want a right twist or a left twist, that's how they come. And you just have to buy one differently for what you do. But you could do that. You could buy 3 of these and you could make a set within probably a few hours. And I think this is probably one of the easier to use setups, not as precise as the Bitzenberger, but it is going to provide you a good, reliable result pretty consistently. And for the average shooter, I think that this is probably one of the more favorite tools that I would recommend in regards if you're getting into doing archery and making your own arrows. Now, one of the other ones that you'll see very common is this one here. And this is so that you can really do 6 at the same time. Uses the same concepts as the Bitzenberger, not as precise in regards to some of the placement, though it's effective. You know, it does really the same kind of job. I've seen some great arrows come off of it. And because you're really dealing with being able to do 6 at one time, it allows you better precision than the Arizona one, better flexibility, but being able to really have the benefits of doing multiple arrows at once, because it sometimes can be tiresome when you do one arrow, set it down, come back 10 minutes later, do another fletching, set it down. You know, can be time consuming. It sometimes can take a week to get, you know, a dozen arrows built, you know, if you're having to do it that way. While something like this or something like this would allow you to be able to, you know, do it much quicker. I wanted to show this as well. So this was an example of someone laying in some serving around the shaft here to hold on the arrow. So I think we had someone mention, like, you know, what would have been period. You would have seen this process as probably the most common period fletching jig. And that's the purpose of this. We wear these little stripes on a lot of times of our period arrows, mainly because we like to let everyone else know, like, hey, it's a period arrow and it's cool. I'm cool too. So we do that out there when we're shooting. I personally am not a big fan of the strings because in my range, we don't have grass, we just have rock. So this, I miss once and it's already basically torn all these serving, and there's nothing left of the serving on basically on the arrow at all. So you would never be able to miss and be able to maintain this kind of arrow, you know, on my range. But you know, they look really pretty, and it would be period. You know, a Fletcher in the, you know, back in the, you know, 1000 AD here would have basically, you know, would have basically have taken a shaft, you know, cut a couple of the feathers so that it had little edges. And then basically what they would have done is they would have tied those edges down and really kind of set it to where it was equal distance. They would have put a little bit of glue or probably pine pitch on these feathers, and then they would have went through and held them on so they had time to dry and affix to that arrow, you know, with the, you know, the whatever small serving that they were using on there. So this had been very period. You would have seen it theoretically afterwards. They could have pulled the string off and continued to shot it, but I think that the evidence is that a lot of times they left the string on. But the string on was really put onto it purely to affix, you know, the fletching onto the arrows. So this would have been a more period setup. Today we don't use pine or pitch that much. Anyone ever mess around with pine or pitch? Any experiment with it?
Yeah, I wrap my arrows. So I didn't have any problems in the arrows under rocks, but like you did, but yeah, it helps my back in a little bit, in my opinion, with my arrows, but it does make it a little heavier.
Mm-hmm. It definitely adds weight, and when you're looking at the front of center weight, you know, that is something to consider, and we'll talk about front of center here in a little bit, but I've noticed that too. So I struggle with getting enough front of center without making a really super heavy arrow. Yeah, so it looks cool. I like it from a, you know, threading them like that, but you are adding a little weight to your arrows, and you know, the issue is if it comes off of one arrow, that arrow is now going to shoot differently than the rest of your set, which is, you know, part of archery can be somewhat of a challenge. Has anyone ever used pine or pitch though as a fixing mechanism? No. So I experimented around with this, and it was definitely an interesting experience. It's actually works surprisingly really well. And if you ever want to play around with it, it's real easy. If you live anywhere with pine trees, just look for some pine sap. And there's processes basically where you just want to move a little charcoal into it to be able to have it dry up better. And you can basically just heat it up just like we use a lot of modern glue sticks and affix it on there. So if you're ever looking for kind of like really like, hey, I want a great art project to be able to make a set of arrows using, you know, some like period materials, not that difficult to actually use as a material. And if you're ever lost out there in the woods and need to survive, man, it is a great glue. So, and you can actually make a bunch and save it. It saves really well. It's actually works out really well. So I played around with it a little bit in regards to making sets of arrows. Not my preferred method. You know, if I'm trying to make a set, you know, because obviously we make tons of arrows. So some of the things that I like to use is like this Fletch-Tite or Duco cement. I've had some challenges in regards to Fletch-Tite because of some of the finishes I put on when it comes down to, you know, the types of sealants that I use. So, or even the types of paint that I might have used on the arrows. So depending on what you're doing in regards to the finish, I would double check, make sure that it's going to be flexible with Fletch-Tite if you're using Fletch-Tite. Otherwise, I've had great success with Duco cement. Once I made the switch to it, I personally don't think I would go back to Fletch-Tite just because it seems that it doesn't matter if I'm putting it over paint or other, you know, wipe-on poly or, you know, Danish oil. It seems that it has been flexible with all of them and it holds tight. So I personally have made the jump over to Duco cement from that, and they're both about the same price. They're a couple bucks when you order them online. Any questions on Fletching Jigs? All right, well, let's go ahead then. We'll move on. Let's talk about fletching itself. So Juliana, I think you mentioned earlier in regards to that, that spinning effect of the arrow. And that effect is great to have. Like if you can have a consistent arrow that does that for you, you're going to find that it's going to vary less when it comes to wind, when it comes to a lot of the interferences that you have. You'll also find a little bit more accuracy when you're shooting longer distances. It's not always required. I can tell you that it's amazing when you really look at it, like you want an arrow to do something a certain way. I can tell you some of the first arrows that I built, I was shooting in the wind and the front of center was almost in the middle. And I had the wrong wing set on it for the angle. So they were like, it was fighting not to spin. So like it wanted to spin, but I had like done it incorrectly. By the way, I shot really well in the tournament. And it was amazing to watch because the wind would actually turn the arrows almost sideways in the air. And then as it got closer to the target, it would snap into place and actually hit where I was shooting. But the wind was really messing with them, and it was really obvious to watch them because the front of center was almost in the middle, and it had no spin to it whatsoever because I had done it incorrectly. But what was amazing, the aspect of what I was flinging is really that tip. That tip of that arrow is what we're throwing when we're shooting a arrow. We're actually throwing that tip, everything is really just designed to direct that tip to where we're going. And what's amazing is that you can do a lot of it wrong and still find a way to shoot well, you know, even though, but obviously it's a lot easier if you do it right. So this is kind of why I wanted to talk about, you know, some of this aspect. So first off, I want to look at like left wing and right wing, because this is the simplest version of why an arrow is going to spin when we shoot it. So when you look at a feather off of a bird, if it's coming off of a left wing, right, you have the stem down the center, and then you've got the feather aspects off of either side. So when you cut that, what you end up with is this little lip. And if you see here, this little catch lip, right, this acts almost like a wing of a airplane. And if you think of an airplane, the way an airplane works is as the air moves over it, right, it creates high pressure and low pressure. And then, so basically it creates lift as the object wants to move towards the low pressure. What this does, the way that it's set up, is it creates high pressure here, low pressure here, which actually creates a rotation just like a plane would. If we did this reverse, if we did two left wings, let's say, or if we did a left wing here and a right wing on the same arrow, right, and we did that, what we do is we'd create a pocket here of a lot of high pressure that would actually lift that arrow incorrectly. So it's important that you use the same feathers, be it left wing or right wing, on the same arrow. So a lot of times it doesn't matter if you like, hey, I like using right wing feathers, that's fine. Or if you like using left wing feathers, that's fine. There's really no right or wrong in regards to which one you want to shoot. It's really just going to be the determination of how that arrow is going to spin. So some people like, well, I want it to spin because as it spins, it may drift a little bit. So some people like, well, I want it to spin in, and some people want it to spin out. It's totally fine. There is no right or wrong when it comes to this. But what I'm telling you is that you've got to have left wing, all left wing, or all right wing. Otherwise, you're going to mess with the aerodynamics of it, and you're not going to get spin whatsoever. You're literally going to get an arrow that wants to move away from where you're aiming it, which can be frustrating from personal mistakes that I've made. So that's one thing I would tell you is if you're going to try to make your own arrows from feathers, or if you're buying feathers, make sure that you're buying either all left wing or all right wing arrows so that you can make sure to be able to do that, because this is where a lot of that spin starts from. Now there's also ways that we can manipulate this spin, right? This is what we like to do is like, I want to make that better. And that's when we start getting into, now we're going to align our fletching differently. So obviously straight is a really common way to do it. I personally lay all mine in straight. I've done some offsetting and helical in the past, and I find it challenging as I replace feathers to make sure was like, oh, was this one offset or was this one helical? And I'm shooting a helical, and sometimes I've got old arrows that I'm practicing with. I wanted them all consistent, so I just decided I'm going to lay them all on straight. And it's worked well for me. I can tell you lots of ways to shoot. There's no right or wrong when it comes to it. You can create better spin by doing either an offset or a helical type lay-in. And when we go back to the jigs, a jig like this actually will come in a helical setup. Same thing with these little clamps will come with a helical setup. Or you can offset them yourselves. There's little dials that allows you to offset them so that every arrow is offset the exact same as you lay them on. When it comes to these Arizona Fletchers, I believe they come with an offset on them. So you buy them either left wing or right wing, and they will have an offset that accentuates that left wing or right wing twist. So if you're going to use the Arizona Fletcher, Just realize that they sell them with those offsets already in place. They are not helical. I've not seen one that actually does helical on them. They may have them. I'm not familiar, but I've only seen the ones with them offset. So these are really kind of the different ways that you can lay them on there, and this will affect it. Actually creates a better effect. Now, one of the things, if you're doing left wing, you want to make sure that you're offsetting correctly so that you're accentuating the right spin. Otherwise, you're going to offset it. That's going to then offset the spin you're creating based on the left wing. So something to kind of keep in mind as you're laying them in there, you want to make sure that you're playing them in there correctly. All right. One of the other things that I have on this page, and then I'll open up for some questions on this, is flu fetchings. I just think it's kind of interesting. And if you've never seen it, I like to just kind of like bring it up. This is for bird hunting. I would love to do some shoots that had us out there with some flu fletchings. And essentially what it is it's really slow arrow. And what you'll find is some really great spin on it. And if you're shooting in the air, what it does is it has a lot of initial force, and this parachute that we've created in this back spins the arrow and slows it down really quick. So if you're shooting a bird, which is close range, up in the air, 10 feet, 10 yards, 20 yards, maybe beyond that, it'll slow it down after the fact so that it comes down to the ground close by. So when we do like a lot of shoots that are, like cloud shoots, this would be something that would slow down way before you would get out to where they set the cloud targets at, because of the design to it. But it's really designed to slow the arrow down and then let it fall out of the sky so that it doesn't end up, 100, 200 yards away. So it makes it easier for doing stuff like bird hunting, especially if you're in a group firing in the air. And then the other thing I like to put some consideration in regards to how you guys are laying out your arrows is when you have a shaft like this, the offset from the end of the arrow to the end of the fletching is a big consideration. Because we do a lot of royal rounds, it has a lot of speed shooting, I personally offset mine a lot like this right here, where it's a good inch offset. Now, aerodynamically, the closer you get that towards the end, it's probably better aerodynamically. Though what you end up with as a challenge to that is going to be when you're grabbing your arrow, how quickly can you grab that arrow, drop it on, pull, and fire accurately? And in doing so, this gives you a little bit more of a handle to grab. So personal preference. So something to kind of think about is this placement can be critical in regards to how you're actually going to be using the arrow, and does have a little bit of effect because this is going to affect that front of center weight as well. So it's moving a little bit of the weight forward. All right, you guys have questions on orientation, positioning?
Toki in the chat window said, I also use the offset to touch the tip of my nose for consistent draw.
Yeah, okay, wow. So that's actually a good way to do it as well. Anytime, and I know we're not really kind of talking about sometimes the the actual archery itself, but having additional anchor points. So be it like you're gonna hook something here or hook something up here. I use the tip of my nose quite a bit because I'm placing it onto the string as I'm shooting. So getting a chance to place it up onto the arrow is going to give you some consistency. So much of this art is creating consistency in regards to anchor points. We might have 20 some anchor points that you're doing in regards to, I position my arm here, this arm here, touches my face here, here, and here. The more points that you have that you can be consistent with, the better off. So if you're doing that with your arrow, that's great, because that's creating one more place that you can actually place something to create that level of consistency. All right, anyone else have any different strategies that they've used? Anyone ever done any sort of like helical, twists on theirs?
I've tried the helical. They're kind of a pain in the behind, in my opinion, to get it to like line up right. They look beautiful, but they're a pain.
Yeah, and that's been mine. Is they're a little bit harder to fletch, which for me makes it challenging when I'm making a new set, because I really like to try to keep them all as consistently as possible. So that my set that I pick up, the next set of arrows, is identical to the arrows I made 6 months ago or a year ago.
Very true.
Callum,
Excellent. Yeah, so lots of different options, a lot of things to experiment around with. Any other questions?
Callum, what are your thoughts on Fletch tape?
Fletch tape. So I personally am not a fan. I know that there's some people on the call that love Fletch tape. And I'll tell you why I'm not a fan. Because I think that it's amazing if I could actually get it to work where I'm at. But because of the temperature, and I keep a lot of my arrows in my garage, so at about 120 degrees, it begins to wear on the glues. And unfortunately, I don't keep my bows in the garage, for that purpose, because of what it does to wood. But my arrows, I do. And it just peels them up. So I've done multiple times. I've played with them, and they look great, and they're ready to go, and they feel all tough. And after a few weeks sitting in the heat, they start to peel.
Gotcha.
So I've had bad experiences with them. I know some people who don't fight the extreme heat, and the dryness that we have here in the desert, really swear by it. And I can tell you, they're great to use because you can lay them on really quick and build a set really quick, which is kind of frustrating with glues that you have to wait. A lot of times we wait too long, though. This is something that I personally learned later on, is that we don't have to wait until it's completely hardened to move on to the next fletching. Is most of your glues, like Fletch-Tide and Duco Cement, they actually accrue the majority of their hardness. So I think something like 80% of their hardness is created within like the first 5 minutes. So when you lay it out and you lay it on there and put it on, you can literally like do something else, but you only need to come back 5 minutes later. So when I was first doing them, I would set them up and then come back 2 hours later, and it really stretches them out when you're trying to make a set.
Yeah.
So
my experience with the Fletch tape, I use it. I love it. But it will peel up with heat. But what I tend to do is put a little daub of super glue on the front of the quill and the back of the quill, and it seems to be enough to hold it.
That's what I was going to say, is I'll put a little Fletch-Tide top and bottom, and then I do the serving with the silk thread around it too. So that's probably why I've never had a problem with it.
cool. Yeah. So that's definitely good advice, in regards to being able to lay that on there. That's probably good for safety reasons too, because I don't know if anyone else has had the experience, but I've shot a few fletchings into my hand, being peeled out. So we take a little bit of those little flesh wounds. So having to watch that.
As long as it hits in the gold, right? That's it. That makes it all worth it.
As long as the arrow hits.
Exactly.
I'll take whatever pain it is between now and then, right? So excellent. So yeah, Fletch tape, I guess it's a love and hate kind of thing. I don't know anyone who's ever had any issues with shooting them when in the heat. So I don't think that they're so sensitive where if you shot like at a tournament at 100 degrees, you're probably fine. I think it's the long-term storage is where they kind of lift, which is where I've kind of run into challenges with them. All right, great questions. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump on. I want to make sure we're staying on track for when it comes to a time situation here. We are, I think we're doing good. We have
At my
another
clock, you got another 30 minutes. It's 12:45 is when it shuts down, I believe.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. So I just got a few more things to kind of go over, and if we finish early, I'll like, open it up for some questions. But I don't know if anyone's ever gotten a chance to do some feather cutting themselves. Obviously, it's not always economical, I can tell you. So I wouldn't know unless you're acquiring the feathers yourself, you know, from like if you have some turkeys, or, you know, you can just harvest them from the forest. Otherwise, like I said, if you're acquiring them, they're about the same price or sometimes even more than if you just bought them pre-cut for you. So they are kind of a trade-off on that. But they're not super difficult to create on your own. So there's some jigs up here that you can acquire that literally just have the razor blade set up. You can lay the feathers in and they come out exactly how you have them set up. So if you have like a jig for either banana or what's, you know, your traditional or shield cut, you know, which is very common ones, you know, you're going to basically be able to just turn them out really quick. Again, you need to pay attention to left wing, right wing in regards to how they're being cut. You could technically, like in this example here, you could just take a razor blade and literally just cut them down the center. So if you're really a traditional person, and it's really fun to watch these guys that are, but literally you could just sit out there, tie them up, you know, thread them on, set them up with the glue on them, you know, tighten them down, and be using just existing feathers. So these make it nice because of the consistency of the feather, which obviously helps from an aerodynamic standpoint. But, you know, I think it's also a lot of fun. We do a lot of, you know, art kind of projects, and it's fun to be able to just take a standard feather and doing it. Though I would highly recommend, if you're just getting into it, just buy them pre-cut. You're not saving any money unless you're wanting to do a, you know, for the experience, or if you're wanting to do it purely for the, you know, for entering into an art project, then yeah, I mean, it's not that difficult to go the other route, but it's going to add some time to it in regards to building them. Anyone have a preference regarding the type of cuts that they like to use?
I've been, I started off with shield. I've been shooting lately parabolic. I mean, I don't see much of a difference, but I have gone from, like, say, I used to do 5-inch, and I cut down that to 4-inch to try to get a little bit more speed / distance without as much drag.
Yep. I struggle with the same kind of thing where I always want to go to a lower, you know, I shoot a 5-inch shield cut, and some of the reasons why I've done that is just purely because that's the way I set up some arrows a long time ago, and I've yet to break them. So I made the next set matching and the next set matching. So it's really hard to sometimes make that jump without having to strip all the feathers off of everything and really kind of fletching them all a specific way. So, but yeah, so that brings up a really good point. We talked about speed before in regards to the arrow. Like, that's one of the things, if I can reduce the weight of my arrow, it's going to give me a flatter curve, which is going to make me more effective at distance. You know, because it's going to be farther, or it's going to be less of a distance between where I normally shoot, bringing more things into my line of sight. So it's definitely one of those things that we're always kind of shooting for when it comes to that. So going to a smaller feather, so a 4-inch feather rather than a 5-inch feather, is going to help with that, right? It's going to reduce that drag. It's going to make a lot faster arrow. You know, and when you see these Olympic shooters shoot, I mean, they're shooting a little like, you know, sometimes a 1-inch, 1.5-inch vein. You know, they're actually not shooting a really big fletching like we do. So I was always concerned at one point was like, hey, how am I going to tell my arrows apart from everyone else? But it's amazing that everyone chooses different things enough to where I don't think I've ever seen some arrows even close to some of the arrows that I've built.
Lately, I've been I've finally got my device passed sometime last year or the year before, but all the arrows I made thus far, and I will continue to make from here on out, have an element of my device in them. So I can look at that. That's mine because it's got, it's like a dovetail paint on that I've done with a green and white. And then the thing I do to differentiate the sets is I change the color of the fletching. I dye with using sugar-free Kool-Aid packets. So whatever the color the packet is, that's what color your feather is going to be.
Okay, cool. And you do that to the feathers. So do you buy white feathers then?
Yep. The white feathers, and then my wife primarily does orange, so she'll get like an orange and then mix in a little bit of like a red to give it the color shade she's looking for. We use vinegar to prep the feather itself, and do this whole process to them. And when they come out all dyed pretty. Sometimes they smell like the Kool-Aid too, which is a side benefit.
That's always fun. So, all right, well, very cool. Yeah, so I mean, definitely one of those kind of things to explore into is dyeing. I know a lot of the ones that we buy, I think, are dyed anyways. So it's just them dyeing them versus how we're dyeing them.
Yep.
Excellent. All right, let's talk about points. So lots of period style points, right? Lots of really fun ones. So for different reasons and different purposes, I've seen a lot of people, I don't know if anyone does blacksmithing. I have a lot of blacksmithing friends who have recreated a lot of these in regards to some, period styles that they use for different reasons. Interesting thing is, and it kind of goes back to what we're throwing, right? This is what we're throwing down the field. This was the purpose. And in period, they weren't always super concerned about how well it was glued on, because it wasn't always they weren't always concerned about retrieving the arrow, because this is what they were throwing down the field. They were hoping that this would, cut into someone's chest and embed itself permanently, into their heart or lungs, right? This is the goal of medieval archery, when it came to war. So, these are some good examples of some real standard ones. If you're familiar with kind of some of like the bodkin style, ones that you'll see out there. Now, from an archery standpoint, some of these are going to affect the aerodynamics a little bit. It may shoot a little bit differently. And I would also tell you that if you wanted to make or shoot a set of these, that most likely you're not, unless you're shooting your own target, you're probably not going to find a lot of use of them. And the reason why is they tear targets up. They absolutely just destroy them. So if you want to do an exhibition of like, hey, let's see how this pierces through a shield or pierces through a set of armor, having a set like this would be useful for that adventure, to do an expedition, or be able to have like a nice display case, if we're doing some sort of presentation somewhere. But when it comes to actually being able to shoot them on a regular basis, most marshals in most shoots will not allow any of these, including the bodkins, to be shot on the targets because of what they destroy. So, but this is our standard, what we use, standard glue on field tips. So this is what you'll find that you can purchase. Steel usually range anywhere from usually 90 grain up through 125 grain, even 145 grain we use on a regular basis. I know the examples here, 190 grain. I don't know anyone using 190 unless it's maybe for a like a crossbow. Like a crossbow might be using something heavy like a 190 grain. But typically we're in the 125 grain, 100 to 125 grain range typically. But the reality of this is the reason why we're choosing the weight of these tips is based on this thing called front of center. And this is where we want to be when it comes to the balance point. So I like this example here because here's my measured middle and here's my balance point. I need this balance point to be beyond here. So the story I told earlier where I had arrows that were turning sideways is because the front of center was like right here because I didn't have a heavy enough tip for as heavy of feathers that I put on it. So you want to make sure that you're choosing the grain weight that's going to bring you up here. Typically it's in the 125 range, maybe 145 range. If you're doing a light shaft, you may be able to do 100 or an 80 or 90 grain tip. So, but a lot of it's going to determine on, you know, how heavy your shaft is that actually moves this front of center balance. From an aspect of affixing these on, really simply use ferrolite is what I commonly use. There's a lot of other mechanisms. Some people just, they say they just glue them on with like the super glues and things like that. And I think if you're going to do that, you're probably going to lose them. If you're going to be doing that, at some point they're going to let go. You know, might not be right away, but I highly recommend something like a ferrolite, which is kind of a heat. You heat up the glue, and then there's a whole technique of laying it onto the wood shaft and heating up the tip and bringing it on. So obviously we do a regular yearly arrow building class where we get a chance to do this, but that's what I would recommend from a glue standpoint. Or if you really want to go period with it, you could use pine pitch, which like I said, works very similar to ferrolite. You can actually heat it up, it becomes very viscous. You could lay it on, put the tip on, you know, fix it in there and probably end up with very similar results if you're going for more of a period set on that. All right, anyone else have any experience with this or questions on it?
I just gotta concur. I love ferrolite. Stuff is the best. Like I've used like other things and I'm just like lost a lot of tips. The other tip I would recommend is if you're buying like field points like that, 9 times out of 10 they come packed in kind of an oil that keeps them from rusting. So either burn it off or you use like an acetone to clean it. Otherwise, yeah, you'll lose a lot of points in foam butts.
Yep, absolutely. That's a really good tip here is to make sure to burn them off. That's typically what I do, but acetone would work, I assume, as well, because you want to get that oil off of it so that it really fixes good. All right, excellent. Anyone else have any experience with it or tip advice? So I'll give you kind of some of the tips that I use to make sure that they go on really well. One is to clean them really good. The other is I heat up, so I put the glue, I basically melt the glue onto the tip of the wood. So if I had a shaft, and let me see if I can kind of demonstrate here. So if I have my shaft here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually lay the glue on to the tip, and then I'm gonna heat up my arrow point separately on the side. And then what I'm gonna do is when it's super hot, it's gonna melt the glue on as I'm putting it on it. And then once it's on pretty nice and firm, I'm gonna immediately either dump it into water or what I usually use is a rag, like a wet rag that's gonna instantly cool it off. And it basically shrinks it right onto the tip of the arrow and into the glue. So I get really good, strong holds by going through that method. Okay, let's jump on to arrow shafting. I saved this for last, the arrow shafting, because I think there's a lot to arrow shafting. So I really wanted to make sure that if you guys have questions that we're referring to it. So one, I was going to show you guys here. This is a little device that you can get real easy to be able to, it works like just like a pencil sharpener, and you can sharpen the tips for putting your tips on or your nocks on. So if you're using plastic nocks, this right here will actually do everything you need. One side is for nocks, the other side is for tips, and it allows you to basically glue them on without any problem. But when it comes to shafts, you've got a lot of options. One is going to be the different wood type, right? And I might choose this because of either flexibility or I might choose this based upon the weight of the arrow. If I'm trying to build a light set, kind of like what we were mentioning earlier, because I'm trying to improve my distance shooting, I might want to look for a wood that's going to be lighter than maybe what I'm shooting, so that I can use a lighter tip and still remain front of center when it comes to that weight distribution. So there's a lot of different things that kind of take into consideration as you're going through making your choices. One of the most common is the Port Orford cedar. It has good flexibility, which allows you to stick to a pretty light weight, and still be able to have the low spine weights for what we typically shoot. So we're shooting, 20, 30-pound bows, 40-pound bows. And when it comes to the spine, we usually want a really flexible spine because it's a really low poundage bow. So we can actually find those with a lot of the Port Orford cedar, and we'll talk about spine weight in a second. But when we get into some of the other woods, you're dealing with something that's a little bit less flexible, and that can create a problem. So, but lots of different kinds of woods, lots of different shaft diameters. So I personally, I'm a big fan of the heavier shaft diameter. So I shoot 11/32 shaft diameter, and a lot of it's because I essentially have been shooting it that way for a long time. I've experimented around with other shaft diameters and have gone back to the heavier shaft diameters. Though what ends up happening is that with the shafts, is a heavier shaft diameter makes it more difficult to find a lighter spine, and I'm dealing with more weight, right? So I have some challenges by sticking to the heavier shaft, shooting 11/32. The closer that I go down the line here, allows me to get into a lighter shaft. And as you can see, there's just some examples here, to be able to be sturdy enough to be able to still use it as an arrow, but to really have the lightness. To show you that as an example, when you look at like how a Olympic shooter shoots, Olympic shooters shoot, they shoot graphite, which is a super light material, but they also shoot the tiniest diameters. It would almost be like this final diameter in here, which I have no idea what that would be, in shooting, because it's so less resistant and so light, it allows them to be a lot more efficient in regards to their shooting. So ultimately, that's where you want to go, but it's a personal choice thing. I like the heavier diameters because they're a little bit more forgiving to it. One of the other things to take into consideration here is the tapering and barrel shafting. This is something that's going to be a little bit more towards the advanced level. I've played around with it. I've made some sets that were barrel shafted and some that were tapered. And the concept being is that we're creating better front of center weight because we want the wider version at the end there. I had some arrow stability concerns, which is the reason why I moved away from it. And so I don't use any of the tapered or barrel shafted, but you can actually get it, rather than being the same thickness and diameter the entire way, they change. They can either be smaller or larger depending on what you're trying to do. Anyone got any experience with this?
Oh yeah, it's all I've been shooting recently. Last couple of sets I've made are the tapered the 11/32 down to 5/16 and the knock end. Try to get that FOC up and all that great stuff.
Yeah, and has it worked out pretty well for you?
Yeah, thus far. I mean, like I said, the last couple of sets that I made have all been tapered shafts. A little bit more on the pricing because that's how I buy them. I have the manufacturer do the tapering for me. They send me that. And downside to that is if I knock off a knock off the end, it's kind of hard to once you crack the end of it where the knock is, the arrow's done. You can't just chop off and retaper and get moving.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I typically use all my broken arrows for crossbow bolts. So, you know, as I break them, I can use them, you know, kind of recycle them for a set of crossbow.
It's a good idea.
Yeah. So, but it becomes difficult when they're not the same shape because depending on where you're using them.
Exactly.
So lots of different options there. Let's talk a little bit about draw length because this is important because obviously we don't want any longer of an arrow than we need it. We want to basically make sure that our arrows are custom fit to what we have. I personally am fortunate because I have a 32-inch draw length. So this actually allows me to not have to worry about cutting my arrows every time I buy them. So I can just buy them, which is they come in 32 lengths, and I can throw tips and knocks on the ends and just go ahead and shoot them that way. That is probably not going to be the case for everyone. So you want to make sure that your arrow and your draw length is to how you're shooting it. So when you want to measure this, there's a lot of different methods that are out there. So the common one you'll see is the arm span divided by 2.5. You know, is a good way to do it. So there's some averages based upon what your height is, what you might be if you're trying to just guess where you need to be based on your height. And then, but the true actual length, and is a picture of it here, is going to be right from the very end all the way to where you're pulling it back. So, but basically, so what I always recommend is you can just get an arrow. Get a full length arrow, and that's usually what they do is they mark it out there, pull it back to how it's comfortable for you, and then have someone mark where that is and then measure it so that you can then cut arrows to be effectively that length so that you're not adding any additional weight that you don't actually need.
Another tip, if you don't have anybody else there in the market, is you can put like a playing card on the front. And as you draw it back, it pushes the card forward, and right at the front of the shelf, that's your longest part. Just add an inch for that.
That's a great way to do it. Yeah. So that way you don't need anyone else around you. You can just put it on there and just pull it back. So this one I think is really important because it's important for us to understand that when we're choosing the shaft, it's going to come in certain sort of spine weights. And these spine weights, you're going to find these charts that are out there based upon the poundage of the bow and the length of the arrow in regards to what sort of spine weights you need to achieve the level of deflection. I really like this chart because this is exactly how I feel when I shoot, right? If I'm shooting too stiff of an arrow, it's going to deflect off this, this right here, and I'm going to be hitting way to the left. If it's not stiff enough, it's going to be bending way too far in, and I'm going to be missing to the right. I'm really looking for this perfect bend around to where it's actually lined up with the string. So the string's pushing it, and it's going to bend around this pole and actually hit the center of the target lined up with the string. So this is essentially what I'm looking for, and this is a really good indicator of how I need to get there, assuming where I'm at in regards to my bow weight. So knowing your bow weight, knowing your length of your draw length, and being able to kind of figure out that allows you to pick wood with the right spine. This is a good description of how they measure the spine. They basically just take a piece of wood dowel, they hang it between 2 points with a 2-pound weight in the center, and then they measure the deflection from the center on that to know how the deflection is. Obviously, more deflection, right, lower the spine weight, higher, or the less distance here, higher the spine weight. And then that's how they determine it. So that's definitely one of the things you want to consider. Outside of that, my last little tips here is when it comes to finishing, I heard that there were some people who like to paint. So you can get little devices that actually allows you to put these little crestings on, and you can either dip them in white or paint, or you can really color them. I know some people just spray paint them and they end up with good success. I like to work with wood, so I've always wood stained them and stained them in different colors, and then finish them. And I've done some cresting. I don't have a cresting jig, which is kind of the challenge to be able to get real crisp, clear lines on them. But if you have one of these cresting jigs, you can really create some great examples of it, and it's, again, really popular. The finishing of it I personally am a fan of the wipe on poly, which has been a good sealant for me in the past. And there's two things I do: wipe on poly to really kind of seal it, keep the moisture out, or a Danish oil. I've gone to now to where I don't use the wood stain. I just get a Danish oil with a stain to specific color, and that's a one wipe scenario for me. I can, put about 3 coats of them on, but allows me to not have to worry about stain and then seal. I can really kind of do it all at the same time, which I've ended up with some really good results in regards to doing it that way, just using Danish oil as my finish. The other thing I like to do, and this is from a usage standpoint, is I have a little bit of liquid beeswax and mineral oil, I believe, that's mixed together. And I like to wipe that on after everything is finished, so it has kind of almost like an oily layer on it, because when you're shooting into some of these butts, it really locks in place, and it takes a little bit to get them to break free. So that's one of the tips that I have.
I have a question in regards to shaft length as far as it pertains to crossbows. Paul turned my wife to the dark side, and I've of course joined her and everything. But is a longer crossbow bolt, is that more accurate?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay.
And I do shoot a crossbow as well. And I think that some of the perfect lengths of them is around like 22 inches. People
Okay.
love 16 inches because you can buy a 32 inch and cut it in half. Though I've heard a lot of evidence showing that a 20 to 22 inch crossbow bolt is going to be a lot more accurate, because you're going to get a better front of center, and you're going to get better aerodynamics coming off of it. So without having to go to some really heavier weights. The alternative to that would be to try to maybe increase your front of center weight. So going to a 145 grain or heavier, and possibly even making your feathers farther back and smaller, so that it creates that better aerodynamics to it. So there's some ways that we kind of trick our way around it, but 20 to 22 inch is what I hear is kind of the better options.